It has been an absolute pleasure. I always love these conversations. This is exactly how our conversations go every single time, whether an audience is listening or not, like when we're in a car or in an airplane. And I'm glad that we got to capture this intimately and bring it to the audience. I want to set a little bit of the groundwork here, explaining what this episode was. We talked a lot about happiness, personal development, personal journeys, and what that means to us and our development today. The episode was intimate and raw. It went really long. We're going to edit this episode, and so not all of it will make it, but it is longer than normal. It's more of a fly-on-the-wall conversation, a look at, an intimate conversation between two friends who are sharing in a really vulnerable way. I want to warn you that there is some explicit language in this episode. If you have children that you listen with, I would just caution you because, it became pretty raw and vulnerable, and language was involved, and I apologize in advance, but I did want to warn you in case you have children listening. Welcome to the Dynamis studio this week, guys. We have a very special episode. We're trying something new. It's the first in-person podcast in the Dynamis studios, and so we are exercising this out. We are working this out and doing the best we can. Finished is always better than never starting. So finished is better than perfect, and we're going to work some stuff out in this episode. I want to welcome a very special person to me in my life, my friend Jeremy Taylor, into the studio today. And I'll kind of lay some groundwork of what Jeremy and I are going to talk about and why I asked him to come in here. Jeremy and I have a unique community that we both participate in. We are in GoBundance, and I've talked about GoBundance a lot. And there's a lot of really powerful things about GoBundance, but by far, the value of this group comes from in-person meetups, being vulnerable, sharing our journey, sharing what we've learned. And every time that there's a trip and Jeremy's going, I always make sure that I'm in proximity to Jeremy at some form of the travel, whether we're sitting next to each other in the airplane or sharing a car ride together. He's just a person that I'm naturally drawn to because he has so much insight and so much wisdom. He's so vulnerable. He's so willing to share his personal experiences. And every time we're on a call, we do these Thursday accountability calls. Every single time we're on a call and Jeremy shares anything, and I'm probably inflating his ego too much. Actually, that's all right. I'm probably making him embarrassed. Every time we're on a call and Jeremy chimes in, you can tell that, we're in a room of men who are accomplished and are doers and movers and shakers, and people listen. People listen to what Jeremy's saying because Jeremy has great wisdom. Jeremy has great insight, and it's amazing what he has to share. Every time I listen to him talk, I'm always thinking to myself, wow, I need to be around this man more. I need to soak up what he has learned. And every single time he shares, people are always harassing him. Jeremy, when are you releasing your book? When are you going to organize this content and bring it to the world? And, I wanted to bring him in here today and talk about something that is pretty unique and cool. And we're just going to call it the Happiness Project. And with that, I'd like to welcome Jeremy to the studio today.
Oh, thanks, man. It's kind of hard to follow that up, but I certainly appreciate it. We can get into my story, we can get into all that stuff, but I think it's important to point out that the reason that I have, what you call so much wisdom, your words, not mine, is because I've been on a path of improvement and ultimately seeking happiness my entire life, and we can certainly get into why that is. I wasn't born into a place of natural happiness. I wasn't inspired by people to be happy. I was just so unhappy that was kind of always my guiding light was, how do I seek more happiness? And I think a lot of people do that same thing for different reasons, but, they chase kind of the wrong goals sometimes, or maybe put certain goals higher than others, like wealth or specific relationships or, anything like that's kind of external. And ultimately, I think to comment on the GoBundance thing, I think what I realized is, in my opinion, everybody is chasing happiness. We just assume that certain things will provide happiness, So we chase those things. But if we really distill it down, what everybody is looking for is happiness. Whether it's success or, a private jet or, passive income, whatever it is, I think people are chasing freedom because they think freedom will lead to happiness. And I believe that it does in a lot of ways, but it's not the only thing that leads to happiness. There's I think it's Nelson Mandela that was incarcerated for a really long time and became happier while he was there. So I think that's a real piece of evidence that that shows that freedom alone doesn't create happiness. And so I've kind of been on this journey, and my performance coach has kind of referred to me as an evolutionist, and that's really kind of an identity I've adopted because it's just so accurate for my journey, that I'm just constantly trying to figure out how to evolve and how to get better and how to challenge my beliefs. Even the things I believe today that I share with people, I know I'll be challenging in the future. And I think that's just an important piece of it.
What would you define happiness as? Because it's a central theme of what you talk about. It's, front and center in the headline of, the Happiness Project.
Mm-hmm.
You feel like, people are chasing happiness. A lot of people are never happy. How would you define happiness?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that people are never happy. So remind me to get back to the initial question, but I think one very interesting thing is we each grade our own happiness, right? We each define our own happiness. I think it's really interesting. I had this kind of aha moment one day where I was I had a bad day, and I was like, who fucking decided that, right? I decided that, right? There's no committee that you sit in front of and they review your day and they're like, man, it was a fucking nail biter, but it was bad. Right? We are the ones that determine whether or not something is good or bad. And a lot of times we look back at what are the worst days of our lives and we realize that they fueled us or that they pushed us or that they transformed us in some way. And ultimately, I think if we look at them deep enough, we realize that those are some of the best days of our lives. And without those, we wouldn't have, the opposite that gives us context over what is good. If you've never been poor, does being rich matter? If you've never, if you grew up in Bali, is the beach the same to you as it is to somebody that grew up in, somewhere else? So I think you have to have those lows in order to understand and appreciate the highs. But I think happiness, I think it's important for people to define for themselves what makes them happy, but also to be real about what that is, right? And I think that's why happiness is a journey. I don't think it's a destination. I don't think it's something you can necessarily define for any one person, or at least I can't define it for you or anybody else. Everybody has to define that for themselves. So for me, growing up in a place where I felt like I needed to get away constantly, a lot of my happiness revolves around freedom. I need to be able to do what I want when I want. But even as I evolve, I realize that that's not 100% true, right? So it evolves over time, and I think most people are just on a path that was predetermined for them. They're chasing a job that has a big paycheck, or they're chasing a job that their parents might approve of, or they're chasing a lifestyle that might look cool on TikTok or whatever. Without ever really thinking about if that's going to make them happy. So I think a happiness audit for each individual person is really an important exercise. Just sit down with a journal and think about what really makes me happy. And I think what you'll realize is the majority of it, I did this myself and I came up with 50 things. And I realized that 99% of them were free. So I'm chasing wealth and I'm chasing, passive income, and I'm chasing all these things when that's not necessarily what's going to make me happy. Do I want to be able to, rent a hut in Bali with my wife? Absolutely. But it's an illusion if I think that is going to make me happy. I think it will add a layer of happiness, right? A layer of enjoyment. That trip will be amazing. And if I stay in gratitude and in the moment, I'll enjoy the hell out of that trip. But I don't think when I'm 80 years old, I'm going to look back and say that was the best day of my life. That was the day I got married and the day that my daughter was born, right? And those were free.
Yeah, it sounds like, as you're talking about all these themes, I'm thinking about...
real quick, sorry to cut you off, but just to go back, I think another interesting thing is, like, I talk a lot about anxiety because that's really where my journey started, and I'm sure we'll get into that at some point. But I think when I was in my lows, my dungeon of anxiety, there was a point in my life where I dropped out of high school and I didn't leave my bedroom for 10 months. And I just had panic attack after panic attack that entire time. And I don't mean like I occasionally stayed in my room or I stayed in my room for 10 hours a day. Like, I literally didn't leave my room. I would shower every couple of days. I would like crawl to the shower. I would cry everywhere I went. I was like about as low as you can get without, ending it all. And that was certainly on the table. And at that point I thought that, man, if I could just get this anxiety to go away, like, I'll be happy. Right. And I think when we're stressed, we think like, man, if I just get this to go away or whatever. And I think it's a huge part of it. I think you have to get to a point, which was ultimately my biggest accomplishment, was getting to a point where I wasn't living in spite of anxiety. I was living free of it, or at least accepting it, when I brought it on myself. And again, I think that's something that we'll get into, but for a long time, I thought that the absence of anxiety or the absence of stress would equal happiness. And I think it's a great starting point. And I think in a lot of ways, it leads to peace. But we live in a society where most of us aren't going to become monks, and most of us aren't going to sit in a room and meditate all day. And I think that is ultimately how you would be happy with nothing else, right? Like, and if that's your journey, I think it's a beautiful journey. But if you're going to live in our society and you're going to, set goals for yourself and chase things and all that, then there has to be another layer of happiness, right? So I think there's two pieces to it. One is kind of doing your best to eliminate what makes you unhappy. And in most cases, that's yourself. That's your story in your mind. That's your programming, your conditioning. So really getting to a place where you can be happy no matter what you're doing. I take a lot of trips by myself, and it's amazing to me how many people are baffled by that. How many people are terrified by that idea of getting on an airplane and spending a weekend by yourself. I'm a Chiefs fan. I'll go to Kansas City and watch a game by myself, or, some of my favorite times are by myself, but they weren't always, because most people, when they're by themselves, they're kind of just a victim to their own mind and their thoughts, and they want distractions. They want to be around other people. They want to drink. They want to do drugs or whatever they can to just quiet that noise. So I think it's a really, there's two components to it, in my opinion. It's getting to a point where you can be happy no matter what you're doing, which really comes from quieting your mind and learning to love yourself, and learning to be grateful for whatever you have, and quieting that voice in our minds that tortures us when we're not in charge. And then I think the other half of it is identifying what does make you happy, right? So there's getting to a baseline of kind of like neutral, which is eliminating unhappiness. And then I think taking it to the next level is like, okay, what does make me happy? And if I can't afford to do it right now, how do I do it for free? Or how do I, if there's 50 things I've identified that make me happy and I can't afford 25 of them yet, which ones can I do now, right? Like, you can't do everything that you want to do every single day. So, do you like fishing, right? Like, fishing probably costs $20 and you can do it for 3 weeks off of that equipment, right? Like, you take your kids fishing. So, yeah, I just think, taking a walk in nature is free and it makes me feel good. And a lot of times you ask somebody what makes them happy and they'll tell you things and they'll realize that a lot of those are free. And then you touch base with them a month later and you ask them how many of them they did and they say nothing, or one of them, or, or what makes you unhappy. Like, social media, drives me nuts. So, I think.
Why do you think so many people are frozen in inaction? Right? When you can clearly identify, hey, here is a problem, here is a solution. I've walked this path before you. Do this thing, it's going to improve your life. Why do you think so many people are frozen?
I love that question, because it really challenges me, because it's an answer I don't have, and it's an answer I really want to identify. Like, for me to get to a point where I can really help people, ultimately they have to be willing to help themselves, right? So the question for me becomes, how do I inspire people to help themselves? ultimately, I've tried every external source you can possibly imagine to get rid of anxiety. I've spent probably $100,000 in my life seeing the best, doctors that you can see, best-selling authors. There's a doctor in Newport Beach that I gave $40,000 to do a brain scan on me to tell me what was wrong with me and how he was going to fix me. And that road ultimately led to one of the darkest moments in my life, because they didn't do anything different than anybody else does. They throw medication at you and tell you to come back in a couple months and hopefully you didn't kill yourself, So I think, to go back to your question, that's a really important thing. Is my biggest thing is people have to take responsibility for their own happiness. And I think our society wants us to believe that that's not the case. Our society wants us to believe that we're broken and that they have a solution for us. Like big pharmacy, like their whole business model is convincing you that you're broken so they can sell you a cure. And if 10% of those people kill themselves, like, that's just a number for them on their P&L, it doesn't matter. They're having record years because more and more people believe that they're broken. And it's not to say that medication can't help anybody else. I'll just say from my experience, I've literally tried every medication on the market. And none of them had a tenth of the effect that the journey that I ultimately went on has had. So let's talk about that journey. We can in a minute. I just think people get stuck because, what's the best way to put it? I think people don't necessarily believe that they can do anything about it, right? I think people get stuck in that victim mentality that, like, this is just where I am and this is who I am and my dad was like this or my grandfather was like this or whoever was like this and this is who I am and this is who I'll always be, and someday somebody's going to come in and save me and I'll just sit here and pray for that, right? Like, yeah. I think ultimately we have to take responsibility for our own happiness and start identifying the things that we do that make us unhappy and the things that we can do to make us happy, and just have hope that that's going to happen. I think it all starts with having hope. My coach asked me one time, we were talking about suicide, and I was sharing how close I was to that at certain points in my life, and he said, well, why didn't you do it? And I didn't have an answer for him in the moment, but what I've really come to is because I always had hope. I always felt like I could figure out a way to get out of it. And ultimately I did. But I didn't know how that was going to happen, right? And I think some people are so stuck looking for a solution or looking for somebody to save them. Like, we're a society that's obsessed with hacks. Like, GoBundance is huge on that, right? Like, everybody wants a hack for everything. Everybody wants a shortcut. Like, nobody wants to hear that, it's their responsibility. I think people confuse the word fault and responsibility. Like, it's not your fault what happened to you in life, but it is your responsibility. If you were abused, and that's eating away at you every day, like, that's certainly not your fault. But it is your responsibility to learn how to deal with it and learn how to work through it.
Have you heard of the study that they've done? Fleas jump incredibly high. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't even remember. I don't know. Between probably 13 and 20 feet, which sounds ridiculous, but I'm pretty sure that's how high. Now, scientists took a bunch of fleas and they put them in a mason jar. These fleas jump. You've heard this study? Mm-hmm. Close the lid, and they leave these fleas in there for a few turns of generations so that subsequent fleas born in this mason jar are hitting the lid, and they believe that's the ceiling. They can't breach that, and eventually the lid is opened and none of the original fleas remain, and when they open that lid, none of the fleas are jumping out of the mason jar, just because they believe, this belief system is, this is the ceiling. I can't jump any higher than that. You growing up with this anxiety, this crushing, crippling anxiety, and growing up in a system of Western medicine, of pharmaceuticals, take this pill, what really, you talked about awareness of your responsibility and control over your happiness and being present. What was the domino for you that led to that slow trickle of awareness that allowed you to take control back of your life? Yeah,
that's ultimately why I, now looking back at 40 years old, why I have so much gratitude for ironically what caused my anxiety in the first place. So I grew up in a home with alcoholics. multiple divorces, you know, just like I didn't have, I guess I did have some major traumatic events, but I would say they're very untraditional. But it, like growing up in a household like that is kind of like death from 1,000 paper cuts. You know, there wasn't like some armed assailant that came in and did whatever, or some, you know, sexual abuse or something like that. That was like a single event, right? It was just like every day was chaos, and every day was programming that life sucks. Like my mom used to have this saying, she'd say it all the time, that life sucks and then you die and go to Maui. And she would say it jokingly, she would say it like in passing, but ultimately that was like her mantra. You know, she didn't realize that it was her mantra, but it was, and she manifested that shit into her life, and ultimately her life sucked and then she died. That was kind of how she designed her life, just unconsciously. And, you know, if she was around, I'd love the opportunity to change that, but, you know, I can't. So I think, to answer your question, like my childhood, I always felt like I needed to be in control. Even to this day, I realized logically, like I was the best person to be in control in that scenario. Like nobody else was, you know? So I developed this personality where I knew I was getting out of my house the first second I could, you know, for 10 years, you know, and then at 17 I moved out and you know, just started trying to figure out life, with no real mentors or direction on how to do it. But ultimately I just, that cultivated something inside of me where I don't know how to give up. So that applies in every career that I've ever been in, that applies in every situation that I've ever been in, and it applies in my happiness. Like I was never willing to say that I'm broken and I'm just gonna, I stayed in my room for 10 months, but ultimately what got me out of that room was, I was like, I'm not gonna fucking stay in here forever, so when is the day I'm leaving? You know, like when is the day I'm gonna go? And that started with me walking, like literally my goal for a while was to like walk to the mailbox, and like then it was to walk around the apartment complex, and then it was to go to a movie with my friends who I hadn't talked to in 10 months. Like when I went into my room, like it was an instantaneous thing. I didn't tell anybody, like we didn't text back then. Like I was 14 years old. That was like 1996, 1997. Nobody knew what anxiety was. I was just fucking broken, and I didn't want anybody to know. So I just disappeared. And then my goal was to like get out of there, right? So to answer your question, the catalyst was, I'm not going to give up. I got to solve this problem, and I'm just going to keep doing whatever I got to do to solve it, right? And then I got to a place where I accomplished a lot. So I started taking medication, you know, and then that shit didn't work. I remember there was a moment before I left my bedroom that I flushed all my medication down the toilet, and I just said, I'm going to figure this out on my own with grit and determination. And that was kind of my playbook for 20 years. I went from being in a room scared to even be awake to having a very accomplished career in the power line industry to doing helicopter work, stepping off of a skid of a helicopter onto a 8-inch square piece of steel 200 feet in the air, you know, daily putting myself in situations that, you know, are controlled but ultimately people die doing on a regular basis. You know, being in situations with people that were, you know, injured or burned at work, you know, and handling them, you know, fantastically, I guess is a good word. But that whole time I was just living in spite of my anxiety. I wasn't doing anything about it, right? I was trying to, but I was looking for somebody else to come and save me, right? It was like, I'm going to be successful. You know, I bought a house. I had a family. You know, I think certain people put me, you know, in high regard of, you know, all the things that I had accomplished externally, but I was still fucking miserable. And I was always looking for that answer, but I was always looking for that answer externally. That's what ultimately led me to, you know, the super famous anxiety and depression and mental health doctor in Newport Beach. And I remember sitting in there getting my brain scanned And when I was on my way home, I remember telling my wife, like, this is finally the solution. Like, they're going to tell me what's wrong scientifically. They're going to show me on a brain scan, and then we're going to fix it. We got a fucking hole in the wall, and we're going to fix it, right? Like, we're going to get some drywall, and we're going to fix it. Like, very mechanical. And that was like one of the like highlights of my life at that time, because I was like, somebody's finally going to help. Somebody's finally going to fix me. And ultimately, you fast forward 3 years, and, you know, I tried a ton of different medications. I gave them tens of thousands of dollars. My mom passed away, and coincidentally, she passed away at the exact time, like, they had me switching medications. And when you switch, you know, medications that affect your brain chemistry, like, you have to be very careful with it, and they weren't. So my mom passed away. I was switching medications, and I was literally just devastated mentally all day, every day. I was just in tears. I had a 1-year-old at home. And I just thought that was the end, man. I was like, I don't know how I'm going to get through this. But like I always do, I powered through it. I took a couple weeks off of work, and then I actually went back to work, and nobody knows this story, but I was running a crew of linemen outdoors all the time. Luckily, I was in charge of the crew, so I had freedom to kind of come and go as I pleased, but I would literally drive my truck around the corner and just hysterically start crying, because I just needed to get it out. I didn't know any other way to do it. And then I'd piece myself back together, and I'd come back, and we'd finish the day, or, you know, I'd make it as long as I could, and I'd go do it again. And that kind of went on for a while until my brain chemistry, like, evened out from the medication. And then business as usual, like, just power through and figure things out. And it really wasn't until my daughter was born that I really sat and thought about it. And I was like, there's been so many moments since I've had a kid that have changed the way I look at the world. And I remember thinking, like, if this is genetic, there's a good chance that my daughter's going to come to me someday and say, Dad, I'm having these feelings. What do I do? And I had to have the answer to that question. But that was ultimately what it boiled down to, man, is I wasn't willing to do it for me, because my goals were accomplished, right? Like, I had made multiple six figures. I had bought a house. I had the fucking HGTV house. I had the car. I had all the things that I thought mattered. And I was able to push through the anxiety. I was able to keep myself so busy at work in a job that I loved that I didn't face it those times, right? I was able to overcome fear and like embrace that, right? And be like I still struggle with people that are like, I'm afraid I can't do that. And I'm like, that's why you should do it, right? Because that's how I wired myself. You know, so I started, that's where the premise kind of came from in my mind, like this new mission to, like, because if my daughter came to me and said she was having these issues, like, my advice would not be ignore it, power through it, and just be successful, right? So I think it's important sometimes, like, it's a beautiful question you can ask yourself, is like, am I following the advice I would give somebody else?
Yeah.
Right? Like, one of the phrases I use a lot is like, don't chase other people's goals, right? And it's really similar to that. It's like, if your kid came to you and said, like, hey, I'm struggling with something that you've struggled with, like, are you following the advice that you would give them? You know, like, I think about that a lot in my, you know, investing career and in my career in general and in my life, is like, am I following the advice I would give my kid, right? Like, you know, you hear a lot about people that are doctors and they fucking hate it, but they groom their kids to be doctors because they make a shitload of money, and it's like, doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So that's where I started the journey, man, is okay, like, I at that moment, after that last kind of run, and this, at this point I was 35 years old, and I had been on and off of antidepressants, anti-anxieties, anti-ADHD, all these different medications, literally anything you can try. Every time something didn't work, I would go back to the drawing board, and I'm like, okay, it's not depression, it's anxiety. Let's go down that path. 3 years later, that doesn't work. Okay, it's not depression, it's not anxiety, it's ADHD. let's go down that path. The reality is, if any person on the planet walks into a psychotherapist office today, they will give you a test, and that test will confirm whatever the fuck you want it to, right? Like that test will confirm that you are clinically depressed. Mm-hmm. That test will confirm that you are clinically anxious, whatever. The first time I ever went into a psychiatrist's office, they were literally the only people in my life that knew what anxiety was. Like now, anxiety is a huge thing that everybody knows what it is. But when I was 14 in the 90s, there was no internet. There was like nobody was, at least I wasn't. Nobody I knew was going to the library and looking up, mental health issues. Right? Like it wasn't a thing. And I think it's beautiful that people know about it now. But I also think that it's a very convenient seed that gets planted in people's minds, and then and whatever you believe is reality. Yeah. So when you start believing that your anxiety is not a natural emotion, that it's something wrong with you, that it's a chemical imbalance in your mind, I think on the drastic side that certainly can be true. But I also think that chemical imbalance can be healed through positive thoughts and affirmations and belief and journaling and embracing your natural emotions.
I think that like as a society we've grown into this entitlement of comfort, and any like tinge of discomfort all of a sudden there's this flood of anxiety. To go away. Yeah, totally. How do I make this go away? How do I make this go away? And people are seeking happiness, and this is what I really wanted to kind of circle back to, is so many people are seeking happiness and thinking that they're unhappy, but have no idea what happiness is. Exactly. They have no idea. What is happiness?
It's like the parallels between success, whether it's financially or in sports or in whatever, like everybody has when you say the word success, everybody pictures something in their mind, and that's what success is to you. And if you're an athlete, that's, winning the Super Bowl or whatever it is. The journey for any one of those things is the same journey that happiness is, right? It's a goal that you work towards. You try things, you fail, you get up, you try again, you believe in yourself. Like, you don't ever hear an athlete win the Super Bowl and they're like, holy shit, I never saw this coming. You know what I mean? Right. Like, no, they visualized that shit. They believed in that shit. They worked towards that. They dedicated their life towards
every
it,
day.
Right? And if your number one goal in life is happiness, then why aren't we doing those things with happiness? Yeah. Why aren't we looking at our lives and saying, like, I want to be happy? What does happy mean? How do you get to a destination if you don't have it defined? Right. That's like getting in your car and saying, we're going on vacation. Where? Yeah. Right? Like, where are you going?
And that could be the point for your particular vacation, but for most people, like, you have to start.
Right, but even then, you have to drive a certain direction.
Totally.
Right? Like, okay, yeah, there is a place in the world where you could just get in your car and drive, right? But you probably need to get gas. Yeah. You probably ought to get some snacks. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, you probably ought to prepare a little bit, and to prepare a little bit, you're going to have to think about, how long am I going to be driving for?
And before that, before even all of that, you need to get in the car